Welcome to Liberty and Logos, episode 6. We're calling this one Elections, Representation and Misrepresentation. How are you doing today, Amory?
Pretty good. Yeah, yourself?
A bit tired and a bit full of despair, which is why I've shifted to a standing desk mode to try to give me a little more vigor. So to begin with, we have some announcements. Do you want to...
Yeah. I just wanted to explain first of all that we've had about 5 or 6 viewers ask for audio only MP3s available for download, and they will be nested at the bottom of the specific page for the episode on the website. So there's no link to them in YouTube, but if you visit the website and watch the episode on the website or access it there, if you scroll beneath the comments, the link there is for the audio. I also wanted to explain that we are going to be having some guests on the show very soon. So look forward to seeing that in upcoming episodes. And also there'll probably be more written pieces coming through, and possibly some sort of shorter, maybe sort of 10-15 minute videos that will be most likely released as sort of solo efforts, but still through the website. Bellamy and myself will take a topic and essentially record our own thoughts on this theme. Some of these will go out with the disclaimer that they are the views only of that person.
Do not reflect the views of Liberty and Logos.
Yeah, exactly. We hope you find these new features engaging.
So we wanted to start off with some current and topical interests, namely the elections. So we just 1 week ago here in the United States had the Super Tuesday results, which showed, I think, the consolidation of the Democratic establishment to try to stop an insurgent candidate who is maybe not really so insurgent from our point of view, but is relative to the kind of duopoly consensus of the establishment parties. And the polls I've seen, which I think are always somewhat misleading and they only give you snapshots, are making it not look so good for Sanders, but he does still have a strong, enthusiastic organizing ground game, so we will see what comes of that.
On the issue of Biden versus Sanders, I think that the central point on which all of this hinges is Sanders' own determination to actually be his own man and his own candidate. Mm-hmm. So there's good evidence to suggest that 4 years ago he was essentially cheated out of the nomination.
Yes.
by conspiracy inside of the Democratic Party. Perhaps the same thing will happen again, but when that did happen, rather than kind of making a thing of it and saying this is really out of line and chewing the party up. Remember, he is nominally an independent.
Right.
Yes, he caucuses with the Democratic Party in his Senate role, but he is actually nominally an independent going for the Democratic nomination. So my belief is that he's not quite so much of a crusading idealist as he's made out to be. Mm-hmm. And when he caved and said, "Yeah, okay, well, we'll go with Clinton because we don't want Trump,"
it's ridiculous.
I think it's ridiculous, and I think that it shows that Sanders is, like many people, just thinks like Trump is like the Antichrist or something. But if he does it a second time, I think he will. I think he'll do it again. And I suppose the other thing that makes me wonder is there's a few more months until that sort of point is reached, and can Biden actually get that far with his your grey matter intact.
Yeah.
The other day he talked about Kim Jong-un and said that the only possibility is a Trump re-election, and it's really becoming clear how his age is getting the better of him. So.
Yeah.
And you are actively trying to diminish our Second Amendment right and take away our guns.
You're full of shit.
He's experiencing real cognitive decline before our eyes. And now that the Trump attack ads and also Trump himself just in public speeches is pointing this out, I think that could be a huge wild card in terms of Sanders' election, just people becoming aware, because of course most people don't pay very much attention to politics. They are concerned with their families, their friends, their jobs, their everyday lives. They tune into politics peripherally. I think we still have a lot of people, an unknown number of people, who are not aware of Biden's condition, who are supporting Biden just because they're, lockstep.
He was the vice president.
Yeah, lockstep Democratic Party voters. And so to see what happens when they start to become aware of this is the unpredictable part. Regarding Sanders, I totally agree with you that in some way he seems either to not really believe in who he claims to be, or he is somehow controlled and cowed enough that he won't quite defiantly stand for who he is. He could have run his whole campaign this year as, they cheated me last year, and they didn't just cheat me, they cheated you. They did not respect your will. They don't believe in a democratic republic. They believe in establishment cronyism. I mean, he could have come out completely spitting fire, and his base would have loved that. But he's not doing that. And he can't even quite muster the animosity or the courage or the will to attack Biden. Even when he tries to stand for who he is, he has to throw all of these caveats and qualifiers on it, like, I think Joe Biden is a really good guy, he's my friend, we just disagree on the issues. I mean, your whole campaign is supposed to be about how the financial elite, the socioeconomic elite, are running this country, and they're not running it in the interests of the majority. Well, how are they doing that? They're not just doing it with their money directly. Obviously, they have a political class that serves them. And obviously, Joe Biden is one of those people. So if you can't even call out your total establishment, corrupt, primary political rival who didn't just vote for the Iraq war, he continued to push for it when it started to go badly, saying, "Oh, we can't get out now. We gotta stay. We gotta defend the empire." And you can't even call out this guy who is one of the clearest examples of the phenomenon that you're talking about. It just, either he doesn't really believe it, or he's just trying to run as sort of a messaging candidate. I don't know what it's. He either he doesn't or believes that he cannot win, doesn't want to, or believes he cannot win.
I think an even more core belief that he espouses about the financial situation, the class element, and the 1% and the 99%, like all of the Wall Street connections in both Obama cabinets. Would be that if I was Sanders and I really believed in, like, we've got to completely make these changes, and I was genuinely against the Trans-Pacific Partnership and NAFTA, and I wanted to do, seriously see big changes, or if I had that sort of Sanders Corbyn mindset, I would just go after that. And like you said, the fact that he doesn't really raises big questions, I think that he probably is controlled opposition. Yeah.
So you wanted to say something about Tulsi?
Well, I mean, perhaps you can open that up. What do you think is the reason behind like this further breaking of the rules by actually not allowing her in the debate specifically? What do you think that she represents in terms of her ideas that you think is they consider to be most dangerous?
Oh, definitely the issue of empire, for sure. It's the only issue in which she really stands out. I mean, most of the rest of her platform was more or less average, and she clearly was running as a messaging candidate, as was Yang, which I think is part of why they were able to actually be themselves more, because they know that they're actually just up there for a message in the same way that someone like Ron Paul was several years ago. And almost nothing is more threatening to the American establishment, or whether you want to call them deep state or national security state, as even questioning the idea of empire, which more and more I think Americans are doing that. And so to have someone up there who, actually, as Ron Paul did, talking explicitly about empire is one of the worst things that can happen to them. It's hard for me to tell, as someone who is now aging into his early 30s, and I at least like to think has a greater and greater consciousness of the things around him, whether the messaging efforts and information control efforts by the establishment are getting more and more hackneyed and desperate, or whether which you would expect to happen as an empire is in decline, or whether I'm just getting more and more painfully aware of them. But some of the stuff around Tulsi, like just ham-handedly changing the rules about who could be up on the debate stage, anyone who is paying attention to that, and obviously they're counting on the fact that most people are not, can just see how plainly that was done artificially to keep her out of the debates. And then the attacks on her in the media of,
Russian spy.
Russians, that she's somehow in cahoots with Assad because she was willing to talk to a military enemy. There was an article in the New York Times that was almost peak stupidity, talking about the fact that she appeared on one of the debates dressed entirely in white, and how this was entirely appropriate because she has a cult following and she's dressing like a cult leader. And just, you're attacking her clothing choices. And then, one of the main brigades against her was that she has a right-wing following. It's like, yeah, there are anti-war right-wing people, obviously. So it just, a lot of it was right up there with just the Russiagate phenomenon in general, as just seeming really desperate in terms of messaging. But I
wonder also whether they're having to double down on the sort of the censorship that they've done already. They have to double down on it, because if they basically let her go up on the stage, she might actually refer to it. And I think if there's a woman on TV using her platform to call attention to the idea that Google, one of the largest corporations in the world, have done this kind of thing, that theme of mass information control could really unsettle a lot of people, I think.
Yes. And so just to be clear, you're talking about the fact that they tried to block access to her website when, I believe it was right after the first debate.
The first debate, no one knew who she was. She basically, with the limited time she had, did a very good job of coming across as, whoa, who's this woman? Yeah. Everyone then rushed to search for her, and they just buried her amongst 34 in the results or whatever. So
and her lawsuit actually just got, so she attempted to sue Google and it just got thrown out of court. So that shows you an extremely dangerous and disconcerting move, as you're saying, in terms of information control, where it is now the case that you're, at least in the case of an agency as powerful as Google, you're not even allowed to get a hearing. And so that's a real case of just putting the boot down in a serious way.
Yeah, and I think that unlike Sanders, she does want to win, and I think it's her. I think this whole military sense of duty, I want to do this for the American people thing, I think she believes in that. I don't think it's cynical. And I think she knows that even if she doesn't get it this time, which she won't, if she stands again in 4 years, who knows? I mean, she in many ways, she is a very powerful candidate across the long term. She's young, she's reasonably attractive, she's she represents a diversity which the Democratic Party claimed to be in favor of. But
unless it's her. Yeah.
Right. They'd rather see two white men in their 70s.
Yeah. I wanted to touch on, so we're obviously, we just spent quite a bit of time talking about the election here. Some people who have either watched this show or been aware of our media projects in the past might be wondering why we see this as any significance at all. And so I just want to touch on, does it really matter in terms of the kind of political, or you could say anti-political projectuality that we have? Does it matter to us who wins? And, I'm thinking of that in terms of real chances for self-determined, self-organized small communities, whether you call it secession or whether you see it coming about through some kind of collapse or insurrection of some kind. Does it really matter? And I have some comments, but I want to kick it to you first.
Well, I obviously, being the sort of pro-collapse person here, I'd love to see Sanders not only win the primary, but the general election, and take America in a full-on democratic direction. Take the national debt up to like 50 or 60 trillion and totally collapse the economy. That's what I'd like to see.
Okay, so there are some economic claims there that we should talk about at some point in the future. I'm sure we'll devote episodes to things like socialism and the market and the libertarian, really free market and so forth. One thing that comes to mind for me is an ongoing conversation I've had with some friends here and there, including Peter Lamborn Wilson, who is perhaps surprisingly, perhaps not to people who are familiar with his work, someone who would prefer to see the United States be a sort of Scandinavian social democracy type of economy, because he thinks that that gives a better space for radicals to do things that they would like to do, because they have, in his eye, more of their basic sort of life needs protected or to some degree provided for by the state. And they are therefore not so precarious as many people in the United States are. For example, in the United States now, a huge portion of the population, over half, can't handle an unexpected $500 expense because they don't even have the savings for that. Or if they get sick or they get injured and have to miss work, they're immediately in trouble in terms of paying their rent or something like that. And so it's his belief that a kind of comfortable, fat welfare state will actually make it easier for radicals to do things that they would like to do.
Are you saying you're agreeing with me? You'd like to see economic collapse?
Well, the thing that disturbs me and what has made me push back against Peter is he is advocating this kind of thing not from an accelerationist angle, but from the angle of actually creating socioeconomic stability for people and looking at the 1960s in the United States, for example. There was a lot of political dissidence, and you can say, some of that was possibly engineered, but some of it certainly at least was genuine, or maybe you think all of it was genuine. And that was happening at a time when people were relatively more comfortable, and their lack of precarity is what allowed them to resist various things. And the reason that I have trouble with this is it's a different age now, and I think if you had an Andrew Yang type UBI, and you have this increasing proliferation of entertainment distraction technologies, and you have now coming down the pipe this sort of, things like sex robots and all of this abominable stuff, that you could have a very, very captivated population, and you would have people being born into that, where the state or the corporate state provides everything for them in such a totalizing way, and they have so little contact with things like ecology or DIY sort of skills, that to try to escape from this all-encompassing, all-providing apparatus would become increasingly unthinkable to them. And so that's what I don't like about this sort of, why don't we try high-tech socialism? Why don't we try UBI? And I understand it's a complicated question, because our people, if they were made that comfortable but their lives were unbearable, maybe that would make them resist more. But it was just a thought experiment.
It sounds, I don't know exactly how old Peter is. I know he's quite a bit older than me. And it sounds like he's kind of nostalgic for the days of Haight-Ashbury. And what I would say to him on that point is, number one, there's good evidence to suggest that the elites actually wanted to either create or infiltrate those kind of counterculture revolutions.
Certainly infiltrate at minimum.
Yeah. I mean, there's especially as far as the LSD thing, there's evidence there of creation as well, I think. And then secondly, in the 60s, America was on the gold standard. So the economy, regardless of what kind of swings it took, was, even when there were big government spending, they couldn't completely divorce themselves from reality. For anyone that really wants to see what the state of the US economy is, they should go to usdebtclock.org and look at the figure total unfunded liabilities, which last time I looked was in the hundreds of trillions.
We can just keep printing. Okay, you want to talk about Britain? Because I want to make sure we have time we're going to talk about some listener feedback later.
Yeah, I mean, I think the major thing the point I wanted to make was that if you're American, and I've been checking, the majority of our viewers, unsurprisingly, are American, no matter what's going on in your country, and yes, many sort of people who watch our show will be thinking, oh, doom and gloom as far as the current state of politics is concerned, you should consider yourself lucky, because essentially England is now a one-party state. And what I mean by that is that it's not like China, where there are no elections, or the Soviet Union, where there were elections, but there was only one name on the paper. I mean, like, there's only one party that has any chance of taking any power, and there's no sign, not even any potential, that this could change ever now. I don't want to go into all the history of how this happened, but basically it's been similar to America, it's been a two-party first past the post contest. Yeah. Increasingly lately, in the Corbyn era of opposition, it's like far left versus centre right, but that's an anomaly, I suppose. When it was Blair when Blair was in power and Conservatives were the opposition, it was centre right against centre right. But all of that's gone now. The Labour Party are finished. Whether some new party, like some phoenix, springs forth from the ashes of it, we don't know. But the issue with is that that's never actually happened in England, that there's been a new party come up and been very successful.
Wouldn't a situation like you're describing, where there's only one realistic party, produce very unstable social conditions in a late aging liberal constitutionalist monarchy, democratic republic kind of place that where it would just be too plain in view that there is no real political option. And I guess I'm making an inference and extrapolating from the United States, where one of the things that produces the stability that we have had is the fact that you have these two parties that mostly do the same things policy-wise, but they're able to run on these cultural issues like abortion and so forth that just inevitably divide people. And it creates this kind of neat, roughly 50-50 split all the time. So the parties just keep trading power back and forth, and there's a sense that something can change, and there's a sense that, oh, you know, we're really doing politics and this really matters. And that's what keeps the population channels and captures their energy, their political energy and their affect. And if that were not possible in England, wouldn't that cause more problems for the establishment rather than consolidate their power?
Well, I don't think so, because first of all, the apathy in England is among the highest I've ever seen anywhere. Most people are so sick and tired of what they've been through, apart from the very young, who are all, you know, pretty far left wokesters. The people of my generation and older, most people are very, very sort of sick and tired of it all and have just totally withdrawn. And then even amongst the people who might in some ways revolt, and I do mean there's like a broad number of ways they could do that, the sort of police state laws that were made in the Blair era are so rigid and have been and will continue to be deployed ruthlessly. And I don't see anyone brave enough to actually risk like sort of a proper armed insurrection, which I'm not advocating for, by the way. And I think it's more or less sewn up now.
So things really are better here, and you're trying to tell me America really is an exceptional nation, the greatest nation.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's do some listener feedback. So we're going to do a significant amount in this episode, and we're getting really good questions and comments, and so we're going to make more time for it, and then it might be that we have to do some triage and rationing with the feedback in the future. Okay, so this is from someone who has the screen name Feral Autistic. It's really going for it there. And Feral Autistic says, in response to some comments that we made on a previous show about spirituality, I think this was in one of the first few shows. From a spiritual point of view, to unify the knower and the known, it may be a mistake to dismiss knowledge that doesn't translate into modern culture. I think certain kinds of anarcho-primitivists miss the point as well if they see prehistorical human animals as having a lesser cognitive ability. And I think Feral Autistic is referring there to the idea put forward by some anarcho-primitivists that there were anatomically modern humans or nearly anatomically modern humans who possibly did not have symbolic thought because we see no sign of their use of images or language or that kind of thing. Maybe they were different in a way we can't understand from within our paradigm of rationality. Is logos the best way to comprehension? Can you demonstrate that without relying on logos? Personally, I wonder what ways of knowing are unthought of in the modern world because they're incompatible with the way we are taught to think. I'm not pushing for any specific competing paradigm to rationality, but rather a willingness to question everything, including assumptions that we don't yet realize we hold.
So what's the first thing that comes up in your mind when you see that?
Yeah, I think that certainly in the modern world, we are very frequently forced to use our discursive reasoning because so much of our world operates now through language, whether it's written or spoken. We Well, I don't know about most. Many people now in the modern West do not work with their hands. They do not necessarily have to use their sort of 3D spatial thinking. They don't have to navigate without the use of maps or other devices. They are distracted all the time by entertainment. So I think certainly we have a different kind of stream of consciousness or day-to-day experience of being than pre-modern people pre-modern people who had a lot of quietude and time and space for more contemplative and intuitive ways of thinking, and I've gotten a little taste of that just in the changes I've made in my life, where I do work more with my hands and more outside and have more time for quietude, and that's just a matter of a small degree rather than the big qualitative shifts that have happened socio-historically. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't have anything like fully formed on this point. I think that my sense is that storytelling is very important to humans, and where that began, I'm not exactly sure, but I find it's a very important thing socially and definitely spiritually. And then I suppose at this point, I would also not defer, but refer people to the Liminalist podcast, which I've been listening to a lot lately, which is found at auticulture.com, auti as in autism. We'll put a link in the description, and there's a number of discussions on there where the host is discussing with his various guests how, in terms of if you have a spirituality, how you explore that in terms of, say, thought, belief, and he's trying to always ground things in the body, and I guess sort of intuition is found more in the body. And you and I in the past have had discussions about how we feel in safer territory when rationally something makes sense. It fits empirically with our experience, and this key in intuition power is kind of focused on it as well. So it's not a complete thought, but that would be what I would say at this point. So the second comment that we've had that we want to respond to is about was in response to the show we did on anarchism, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially to paraphrase and summarize, the commenter is saying that he perceives that you and I don't have any fundamental disagreements, or if we do, that they're very small, that there aren't many of them. And that we're kind of more or less just arguing over words, and so I think that's incorrect, and I think it will become more apparent as the show goes on what the differences are. There's no need to sort of try and force
between our views.
Now. Between our views, I think there are sizable differences. Obviously, we're civil with each other, we're friends, and all the rest of it. But I think there are sizable differences.
Yes. Which was part of the basis of doing the show. Exactly.
Yeah. I think the next question he has, how technological modern society affects interpersonal relationships and community, has to be dealt with as a topic in itself in a future episode.
Yes, and technology is something we'll return to again and again. We've already got a very interesting guest who's going to come on soon, whose whole focus is technology. Mm-hmm. Actually, we have two. Now that I think about it.
Yeah. So. And lastly, the last thing he wanted us to briefly touch on was what our ideas of healthy economic relationships would look like in such a non-modern context. So I'm going to hold my hand up now and say that I think that if you own the land that you reside on, and you are largely producing the food and the sustenance that you need, there's no need for economics really, and anything else can just be gifting. And I encourage people to read about gift economies.
Yeah, I would agree with what you said, and just say I think healthy economics would look like people having a real substantive relationship with their local ecologies, people engaging in the activities they need to survive voluntarily, coming together in gift or free and voluntary exchange, and division of labor being largely or entirely voluntary.
I think also, as much as it kind of irritates me to do this because he's one of my nemesises, and we've had some awful fights on Twitter. Nemesis, maybe, yeah. We've had some awful fights on Twitter, but I actually think that David Graeber's book, Debt, yes, is a very, very, very important anthropological work showing people the true history of the economy.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, this next one was a bit surprising and is certainly spicy. David, who has written us before, writes us again saying, please both of you comment on relations between adults and children. This is with reference to Wolfie Landstryker's writing and John Zerzin's condemnation of it, and anarchistnews.org putting it up on its website, an action which Jay-Z also condemned. So Wolfie Landstryker, for those who don't know, is an individualist anarchist author, very influenced by Max Stirner. He wrote a piece where it was sort of ambiguous, but it could be read as condoning pedophilic relations of some kind. It's not explicit. John Zerzan is an anarcho-primitivist author and has condemned Wolfie for having written this. Okay, David continues, yes, talk about pedophilia, as you both claim to be up for discussing any question. There's a lot of media attention given to this matter, particularly with regard to grooming. I'm going to skip some of it here. This could also relate to Bolo Bolo, in that would your Bolo, that is your small autonomous secessionist community, allow another Bolo to have sexual relations with children, or would you intervene? This subject could also relate to free association, which you both claim to be in support of. It's all well and good claiming to be in support of free association where the lines may be clear and obvious to many. What about when that clarity is challenged?
Okay, so I think the most pressing question there is basically, would you intervene? Okay, so to me, I would want to, and it would be basically a practical consideration. I'm 100% against pedophilia, and I would say that if the neighboring Bolo was like a smaller group or a group that I felt that my group could handle, yeah, I would probably risk going into like a firefight or something like that in order to rescue children that were being abused, for sure. I think the only point at which I would kind of say, be careful here, is we've got these ideas of children and adults, but where you draw the line is something which increasingly is becoming arbitrary, which is not to say that I'm in favor of lowering the age of consent. I would point people in the direction of looking at so-called primitive societies where child abuse and especially pedophilia are almost non-existent.
To answer the viewer's question, I also am firmly against anything that I think reasonably could be called pedophilia, as I think it's a form of abuse and exploitation. Would I attack a neighboring Bolo, I guess is the dicey question. I think it would depend completely on the specifics of the scenario. It would depend on what the relative capacity logistically and even morally, ideologically of the two communities and those nearby would be. But I'm not in any way categorically opposed to interfering in neighboring communities where there is what I would call incontrovertible, severe, sustained abuse of some kind. I do think that, as we've talked about in the past, that a kind of pluralistic world does mean a certain toleration of difference, and exactly where difference crosses over into unacceptable moral deviance would be a complicated question that would have to be decided in the situation, and it can't be reasoned about abstractly.
Again, I feel like I'm recommending a lot of books today, but there's a book by James DeMayo called Saharasia, which is quite a tour de force, huge, thick, massive book, which explains how areas of the world went from being kind of matriarchal, almost no child abuse, and etc., to the opposite, how these changes took place in a certain area of the globe, and it's supported by a humongous amount of data. So I think it's a good one to read.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, the next comment that we want to look at is someone who's asking us for our views about white supremacy and its position in the United States, I think.
Well, there were two parts to this, though.
Okay, you go ahead and set it up.
So this is after our first opening of we released 6 episodes at the beginning of the show, and we started getting criticism, and I said if someone has a serious criticism that isn't just sort of hectoring, then please offer it. And so these people wrote in calling themselves Queer Cannibal Collective, which I guess is what happens when you've deconstructed identity to the point that people are no longer humans but food. And Queer Cannibal Collective writes, in episode 4 of Liberty and Logos, Amory says, quote, "The first issue that I have when it comes to ideologies that are negatively constructed is wondering why they are not positively constructed," end quote. This was in the anarchism episode. They write, "We construct a negative ideology, or an anti-ideology if we take ourselves a little bit seriously, because we find it more useful than the alternative. To us, anarchism is something different than the endless ideological positions for how the world should be. To us, anarchism is a way of describing the world in the process of rejecting it, not because of a counterfactual ethics, but because it stands in the way of our personal desire." So I'm going to pause there, because I know that I know that Amory hates when people frame their politics in terms of pure desire.
Yeah, I think that's a huge topic. I think that at some point we have to put egoism under the microscope and do a whole episode on it. Yeah. Basically, because I used to be very influenced by, quote unquote, rational egoism. But starting with, I guess, about 5 years ago, I started to become less and less interested in it, and now find the idea not just incomplete, but like really kind of anathema to myself. Okay,
well, we'll table that then.
Yeah.
I guess I would just say, to answer the first part of this, I do consider anarchism a set of ethics primarily, and I am a moral realist. I used to be a very hardcore Max Stirner, basically nihilist, existentialist. I'm not anymore, and we can talk about that on the egoism episode as well. And so derivatively, that does end up being a position about how the world should be, but the difference is that, unlike other ideologies, the type of anarchism that I'm advocating for is based on self-determination. So it's not an ideology about how every single person on the planet Earth ought to be living their life and conducting their relationships. So in that sense, I guess it's somewhat negative, but it's a negativity that's downstream. It's not primarily a negativity. In this hypothetical world, anarchists must deal with groups such as white supremacists and religious fundamentalists, either without a power, which is funny because that's such, like, they're only thinking about America when they say that. Like these are like the bad guys in America. Never mind the billions of people elsewhere who don't agree with you. Either without a power imbalance or with an imbalance in favor of anarchists. In our present reality, many on the far right collaborate with and are protected by the forces of the state, and generally want to see state and or capital strengthened and utilized towards their enemies. I guess they mean against their enemies. They reject those who would see it all torn down. Regardless of their internal disagreements on methods, there is no possibility for collaboration with any who prefer the existing systems of power to their absence. Bellamy's positioning of such groups as marginals is laughable. White supremacy, Christianity, and its bastard child rationalism and traditionalism remain hegemonic, though they now share that ground with their cultural descendants. Okay, well, I think we're talking about different people. Obviously, people who are protected by the state are not marginal. Obviously, people who have access to serious state power are not marginal. There are certainly many people on the far right who do not have those things and are continually deplatformed, hammered in the media. Sometimes they're even deprived of things like access to credit cards and banks. I mean, some of these people on the far right are amongst the most hated people in society.
I mean, this all centers around the definition. By any definition, I challenge people to show me that by that definition, that Western countries, including the United States, actually like run anywhere near on that basis. It doesn't seem to me that happens. I don't see in entertainment or in politics and stuff this idea that just white people are better, or that they're superior as whether genetically or anything like that.
Right. I mean, talking about human genetic differences is one of the most taboo subjects in society right now. So I think the reason that these conversations are difficult is that it's a matter of definitions and it's a matter of milieu. So there are plenty of places in the United States now where I would say you can be pretty openly racist against non-whites. And you can even, in certain cases, get away with exclusion, violence, that sort of thing. But these are places that are not well connected to what I would call the major organs of power and influence now, which is the high political class, the media organs like Hollywood, the mainstream media, the academy, the sort of opinion-making places.
If we're to try and locate a white supremacist ideology that has some actual grounding in sort of political life in the world, we should look at the example
in a full, robust way rather than the hangover way that I was talking about.
Yeah, in a way where things that are going on are still being driven by this ideology in people's minds. We should look at Australia. I think that the best way for people to learn about this phenomena is through the film that the left-wing journalist John Pilger made about his home country sometime in the noughties. All of his films are available for free on his website, johnpilger.com. And I remember that this movie starts with an interview with a half Aboriginal, half white, half Aboriginal man in like a Vox Pops interview saying that if you were to make a league table for human rights abuses of all the countries in the world, that Australia would be at the top. And when I saw this film and it opened with this claim, I was kind of taken aback.
Yeah,
I think that you think of like Cambodia or other things like this, but I think the point he's making, and I think it's proven during the course of the documentary, is that basically consistently since the European people settled it, which is a very long time now, you've had constant grievous abuses that are fed by a white supremacist ideology. So people could check that movie out, and they could also type in maybe like search terms like Australia, racism on TV, and they'll find dozens and dozens of clips where news anchors and talk show hosts are just like using racial epithets and saying things which, if they happened in England and America, would be like, whoa. And really, despite there being quite a large number of non-white minority communities in Australia, concentrated in the cities, the government and the media still do very much operate, especially the police. They often there's a lot of video evidence of like young black men being kicked to death in like the waiting room of police stations and stuff like that. It's awful. So that would be where I would point people to.
Much of the negativity that we've gotten from feedback has been about the fact that I talked about the cultural hegemony of wokeness. And for some reason, this was alarming to some people. I don't know why. It would be controversial in the sense that not only are many different segments of American politics talking about this, but anarchists have talked about this many times. Wolfe has written about this in his Ideology of Victimization. Peter Gelderloos has written about this in his piece So Fucked Up. Lawrence Girac has written about this, about identity politics. Ted Kaczynski wrote about this in the 90s when it was not even so hegemonic in his criticisms of the left.
Lupus
Dragonow has written against identity politics. So I'm hardly the first person to say this. So the idea that this, is somehow suspicious that I'm talking about this, I think is maybe comes from a little bit of a sheltered worldview.
I think I'd like to throw one thing at this point while we're on the topic of, white supremacy. I think that certain people have their view of white supremacy formed by being white and living in predominantly white countries, okay? But actually behind the idea of any kind of supremacy or chauvinism is a concept that is not to European, Northern European people who colonized the British Empire, let's say. You can find in southern Bulgaria the influence of a sort of paramilitary ethno-nationalist group called the Grey Wolves, who are basically Turkish nationalists, okay? And sort of ethnically motivated violent nationalism is not exclusively a Northern European phenomenon, nor has it ever been.
Sure.
And why do the same people not say anything about these groups? This to me, sort of this narrowness reminds me of how the many aspects of the sort of particular views of many prominent left-wing figures like Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, their views on ethnicity are often totally obliterated from history. And I'm going to recommend another book, and actually it's by the same author as another book I recommended already, which looks at this very thing. Engels said that anyone who's not, basically white and from that part of Europe was genetic trash, and the two of them,
if they weren't, even if they were Southern European, yeah, and if they in their letters they talk about how it's surprising to them that the people who were showing some interest in their ideas at that time in the mid-19th century were convinced that this was somehow only about economics and politics, and they were kind of saying this is our chance to kind of push for power and sort of conquer and civilize a lot of these kind of non-Northern European peasant people. So it's this idea that sort of chauvinism and violent oppression
begins and ends with like KKK types is just so narrow-minded, and people really should educate themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people with this view, they either don't know or they dislike it being pointed out that, for instance, the transatlantic slave trade was only a small part of the slave trade coming, well, not a small part, was only one part of the slave trade coming out of West Africa, and that the kingdom of Dahomey had essentially a massive human trafficking operation. They were sending people to the Middle East and to Asia, and that both preceded and continued after the transatlantic slave trade, and they see pointing that out as somehow apologizing for the transatlantic slave trade, which I'm not at all. I mean, it was obviously a massive human crime. But when you reframe it that way, you see, okay, this was about power elites. This was about empire. This was about human exploitation. Was it about race? Yes. Part of it was about race, but it was not, that's not the alpha and the omega of what it was about. It was about exploitation and power, and how exploitation and power constantly change their idiom. They constantly change their justification. But in the end, the story of the state is about elites and how they can extract value from others through one form or another of parasitic relationship. I want to make just a few. There's
a lot of examples that have come up in our discussion over the last 10 minutes, which fit very well with the idea of, misrepresentations. And I think that this is something more and more I will want to get into in the show, is offering historical revisionist views, which I think are backed up by evidence, that actually lend nuances to a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Maybe we could, for example, to tie in with what we've just been talking about, maybe we could look at the U.S. War of Secession at some point.
But we have now phenomena like the 1619 Project, for example, being celebrated by the New York Times, which is the most influential paper in the United States, one of the most influential papers in the world, project which seeks to reframe the entire history of the United States in terms of slavery and to explain so much of what has come to pass in terms of slavery, and so therefore is clearly an anti-white supremacist, anti-white nationalist stance, and that's being celebrated by one of the major papers in the United States. It's being brought into school curricula. It's being celebrated by ExxonMobil, who are funding it. We have white privilege training in public schools from a young age. We have affirmative action. We have hiring quotas. We have conversations about diversity all the time, whether it's the Oscars or how were white people versus so-called people of color portrayed in this or that television media. We have diversity, equity, and inclusion offices in universities. We have Google and other big technology companies insisting on intersectional analyses within their offices. We have the New York Times routinely running editorials from these sort of intersectional woke analysis of this or that event. And we have the fact that immigration will soon make white people a minority in the United States, and that there's essentially a bipartisan consensus on this, even though you also have horrible things happening at the border and people making money off of that. You also have an immigration policy that will inevitably make whites a minority and therefore of diminishing political influence. So I know that some people listening to this are going to say, oh my goodness, Bellamy is making alt-right talking points. First of all, that's not an argument. That's known as the association fallacy. And if you think in those terms, I suggest that you attempt to think more clearly, because whether what I'm saying is said by bad people or not does not make it wrong. And I am not saying, as these people say, that white genocide is happening or that white people are under attack or that sort of thing. What I'm saying is that the historical and lingering white supremacist ideology on which the United States was founded and the new and rising woke, intersectional, diversity, equity, inclusion ideology work dialectically. This is what dialectics look like. They work dialectically to divide and conquer the population, which is what basically every elite ideology is about. All elites need to divide and conquer their population, and so you have a settler colonial white population that is aging. They're diminishing in power. They're diminishing in influence in many ways. They're not the richest group. They're not the most represented in elite professions anymore. A number of minority ethnic groups are now more influential than the white population, and yet they still have a significant level of power politically. And so they, from one side, are full of this resentment, this you could even call it ressentiment about their diminishing power. They're easily influenced by the fact that they're angry and resentful about what's happening. And then you have another set of people, including a significant number of white people, who are influenced by this intersectional ideology, who see the enemy as being the straight white male. The conservative, lingering settler population sees the enemy as being these new leftists and these immigrants and so forth, and it divides and conquers the population.
Both sides are playing identity politics,
yes.
aren't they? And the solution to a war of identity politics is not more identity politics, but to try a different perspective.
Yes.
And I think that we'll definitely come onto this more in the future, but essentially, I think that focusing on race is a very dangerous thing to do, because it just continues the same pattern.
Okay. So that concludes part 2. Thank you for the feedback, everyone, and we will see you next time.
Thanks. Yeah.